Do you think that you're better than others? Do you perhaps believe that reading Dostoevsky puts you above those who read young adult fiction? Or maybe you're an overthinker who can't act without first going through every single possible scenario in your head. If so, then you're in the right place, because today we're talking about Notes from Underground by Fyodor Dostoevsky. Now, as usual, I have lots of visual scenes prepared for you, so stay tuned for that and subscribe. Do it. So the protagonist of this book of course has an enormous ego, but not in the way that you may think. Because when you picture someone with a big fat ego, you probably imagine an overly confident person. But this protagonist is the complete opposite of that. He's shy, spiteful, and deeply ashamed of simply being alive. And yet he still believes he's superior to others, mostly because he's intelligent and well-read. So it's no surprise that the stupidity of those around him drove him into isolation, where he eventually wrote down his thoughts in notes from underground. So we finally begin the story, and we actually start here with a note from Dostoevsky where he writes that both the author of the diary and the diary itself are imaginary. But of course we can imagine that such people not only may but must exist in our society. And so Dostoevsky just wanted to show us one of the representatives of the generation that was current in his times. And he also adds that the diary is divided into two parts. The first one is called Underground, and it introduces the character and his views, and the second one is called Apropos the Wet Snow, and it describes some of the specific events from the man's life. And I also made you some timestamps for those parts, but watch the whole video. And so that was the note from Dostoevsky, but I actually have something to say as well, because I always have those scenes on the channel with that kind of like show you where the characters are and which characters are present. But because of the nature of this first part, which is definitely more philosophical, it's more like a theory and nothing really is going on, I'm actually going to give you some points on the screen, kind of like a PowerPoint presentation style. But I also have one scene which we're going to see now because I just wanted to give you like a context that right now we are in the underground man's place, his home, and I also wanted to show you the underground man. So here he is, and he's writing in his diary right now. And so the man is of course called the underground man, and the first thing we learn about him is that he's a sick, spiteful, and unattractive man, at least in his opinion, because remember that everything here is written from his own perspective, and so we don't really know the truth about him and about reality. We only know how he sees it. On top of that, he believes that his liver is diseased, but he doesn't actually know anything about his illness, but that's just because he refuses to see a doctor purely from spite. And he actually realizes that he's not going to pay out the doctors by not consulting them, and that at the end of the day he's only hurting himself and no one else, but still he won't go to see a doctor purely from spite. Then we learn that he's already 40 and he used to work in the government service, but he managed to retire early. He then goes on to describe that he was a very spiteful official and that he was rude to everyone and took real pleasure in being like this. And his reason for being rude was that he never took bribes while everyone else did, and so he had to kind of like compensate himself for that. But then as soon as he writes this fragment about compensating himself, he writes, "A poor jest, but I will not scratch it out. I wrote it thinking it would sound very witty, but now that I have seen myself, that I only wanted to show off in a despicable way, I will not scratch it out on purpose." And this fragment is kind of important to note because you can really see that the man seems to be aware of this invisible audience that constantly watches him. After that, he starts to describe that he always felt intense enjoyment in making people unhappy, which was actually quite easy to do since all of the petitioners in his job were rather timid. But there was this one officer whom the underground man just couldn't stand, as he was not able able to humble him. Although in the end he kind of succeeded, because he managed to stop the officer from clanking his sword, which always irritated the underground man. And interestingly, the man now writes that he was never actually truly spiteful, but he was rather always amusing himself by being like this. But the truth is that if anyone were to bring him something sweet, he might even be touched by it. Although if that were to happen, then he would probably end up lying awake at night with shame for months after. And so here I think you can see the main emotion of the underground man, because I feel like his baseline kinda is shame, as he's just so ashamed of everything, basically. Like, he really is. He's ashamed of every single thing, good, bad, everything is just shameful to him. Just quite sad to live like this. Yeah, and you're going to see that it really is bad, because this whole book is just like misery. Which is not really, you know, that's Dostoevsky for you. I don't know. I actually really like Dostoevsky, even though it's full of, like, his books are full of suffering and everything, but there's something nice about them. I guess also, like, the thing is that I'm from Poland and we kind of share this, like, misery. I feel like maybe this is just like an Eastern European misery. Yeah, but our literature is also, like, you know, the biggest movement in Poland, like one of the most important ones was Romanticism, and no wonder. Like, really no wonder. So, yeah, so there's definitely the shared misery. So whenever I read Dostoevsky, it's just like, this really feels like home. But the underground man now writes that he was never actually able to become truly spiteful, and the reason for that is that he was always aware of many elements in himself that were completely opposed to being truly spiteful. And because his nature was always so unstable, he eventually couldn't become anything in his life, which he describes by writing, "It was not only that I could not become spiteful, I did not know how to become anything, neither spiteful nor kind, neither a rascal nor an honest man, neither a hero nor an insect." But of course, right after reaching this conclusion, the man saves his ego by writing that, well, at the end of the day, an intelligent man cannot become anything seriously, as it's only the fool who becomes anything. After that, the man complains a bit about his age, as he thinks that 40 years is a whole lifetime, and he also thinks that to live longer than 40 is bad manners, it's vulgar and immoral. And so yeah, once again, he has some real problems with shame here. Especially because right after writing this, he asks himself, who even lives beyond 40? Only fools and worthless fellows. And after that, he explains a bit that he was working only to have something to eat, and then once one of his distant relatives died and left him a small fortune, he retired immediately. And so now he lives in his wretched room in the outskirts of the town, and even though he was told that the climate of Petersburg is pretty bad for him and it's probably too expensive for him to live here, he won't leave just because. And he also adds that he tried to become an insect, but he was not able to do even that. And now at this point he starts talking about something very important, so pay attention here, because this is like one of the most important points in this novel. So he writes that being too conscious is truly an illness, because it would be enough to have the consciousness of a man of action. And then right after he writes this, he adds that, well, you readers probably think that I'm writing all of this out of some sort of grandiosity, but gentleman, who would pride himself on his diseases? And then right after writing this, he adds that, well, besides that, everyone praises themselves on their diseases, so even if I were doing that, then that's really normal. And so after that, he goes back to the topic of consciousness, and he writes that every sort of consciousness is a disease. And to kind of give an example, he writes that that the more conscious he became of goodness and everything considered sublime and beautiful, the more deeply he sank into his mud and was ready to sink completely, as he even started to find enjoyment in his loathsome actions. And this enjoyment was caused by the too intense consciousness of his own degradation, from feeling that he had reached the last barrier and there was no escape for him. And what's the worst in all of this is that the underground man believes that this heightened consciousness always results in inertia, which is also a word for inactivity. And so that means that the overly conscious man is not only unable to change, but he's also not able to do anything at all. And then as the man keeps describing himself, he comes to the conclusion that he's always the one to blame in everything, but that's just because he's cleverer than anyone else around him. And also because even if he had a noble character, he would only suffer from its uselessness, as he wouldn't be able to forgive because maybe someone who hurt him according to the laws of nature, and of course you cannot forgive that, but the underground man wouldn't be able to forget either, as he would remain insulted anyway. And finally, even if he decided to take revenge on the one who assaulted him, he probably wouldn't be able to make up his mind to do anything, and he now wants to explain why. The reason is that the man who takes revenge is a man of action, who doesn't overthink but just rushes straight to action. And the underground man is actually very jealous of people like this, even though he calls them stupid. So now we go to the next page of the presentation, because the underground man begins to get deeper into this idea of the conscious man versus normal man. So what we of course know about the conscious man thus far is that he's not capable of taking action, and he also obsesses over everything wrong that has been done to him, while the normal man is a man of action, and whenever he's wronged, he takes revenge. On top of that, the conscious man thinks that he's more similar to a mouse rather than a man, and the normal man is of course the true man. And the underground man also points out that the conscious man almost always feels insulted. And so now at this point, the underground man starts to imagine what would happen if this mouse tried to revenge itself. And well, the first point is that this mouse doesn't believe in the justice of revenge. And the second point is that the mouse immediately begins to doubt itself and starts to question everything around, to the point where eventually it's just a ball of doubts, emotions, and contempt. And so then the mouse retreats to its mouse hole, where it becomes completely absorbed in cold, malignant, and everlasting spite. And for 40 years it will remember its injury down to the smallest, most insignificant detail, and will just torment itself with its own imagination. And then on its deathbed, the mouse will recall everything again in every single detail it can remember. Now, after explaining all of this, the underground man adds that the normal man accepts the laws of nature as his limits, while the conscious man tries to rebel against those laws simply because he doesn't like them. And so we now end this part of the text and we move to the description of the underground man's internal life. And so first thing, he tells us about his toothache, because he concludes that you can find enjoyment even in things like a toothache, and he actually speaks from experience, as he once suffered from one for an entire month. And it was actually pretty enjoyable to him, because in situations like this, people usually are not silent, but they moan. And not with some normal moans, but with malignant ones. And this malignancy is of course the whole point, as it allows him to inflict suffering on others. And then we move to the first point of the presentation, which is that the man lacks self-respect. Which he writes that it's actually pretty easy to conclude, since how can a man who enjoys his own degradation respect himself? And then he writes an interesting thing, which kind of points us to how his childhood looked like, and as you can probably imagine, it was not really happy. Because he gets into the topic of remorse, and he concludes here that he could never endure saying, "Forgive me, Papa, I won't do it again." But that's not because he was incapable of saying it. No, on the contrary, he was actually too capable of saying it before, when he was getting into trouble without being guilty of anything. And during those years when he was younger, he was actually genuinely touched and penitent, and there was this sick feeling in his heart at that time, even though he kind of convinces himself now that it was all a lie. And so we can definitely make a point point here that for the underground man, things like repentance, sentimentality, and tender-heartedness are pure delusions. And even though he clearly feels them at times, he later convinces himself that he was just acting. And well, that really affected him because later in his life he started to pretend a lot just to live in some sort of way. Because I guess the idea here is that once you become hyper aware of yourself, everything that you do is very controlled, and so there's no place for like any sort of emotional whims or something like that. Which is, I feel like this is not really true because I don't know, I would consider myself very hyper aware because I said it on the channel before, but like I am very big on meditation or something. I don't know if you say it like that. English is my second language. Basically, point is, I meditate every day, and I've been meditating for, I don't really know, 2 or 3 years, something like that. I feel like I am also hyper aware of myself, but the underground man has this weird thing. I guess I know where the problem is with him. Because, you know, when you start to be hyper aware of yourself, I think that it's very important that now this is the time for changing, because you are so hyper aware, you are aware how your body works, how your thoughts work, and you kind of start to enter this like edit mode that basically, oh, you know what, I don't really like this reaction that I have to something, let me edit that. Let me just like, you know, start doing things. And I'm not saying that it's easy, because like sometimes you really have to work hard to kind of like edit a specific thing that you don't like, or like a specific reaction or something like that. So it's not easy, you know, and I'm definitely still working on some things. So it's, yeah, not easy. But it is doable, and I think that once you become hyper aware, it's very, very good to enter edit mode and not just being hyper aware, because I feel like the underground man is very aware of himself, but at the same time it's kind of like this, I don't know, like he sees himself as something very stable, or like something that is not able to change. Like he is very aware of himself, but he just kind of ended it at that, you know. It's like, I am this type of a person, I am this, that, blah 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 blah. And it's like, that's the first point, you know. The first point is noticing what you are, and then the second point is editing the things that you don't want. So like, yeah, but I feel like the underground man just reached this first point of noticing what he is, and he doesn't really realize that you can actually change a lot about yourself. You just kind of have to start navigating the change, and yeah, and it's doable. And so considering that, you are not a final product, basically. No one is a final product, and you can change so much. But yeah, but you have to enter this edit mode, which I think this is also why this book is so interesting, because like, I feel like on one hand you can see it as this like, oh, you should not be too aware of yourself because that's just misery. And it's like, yes, probably, but at the same time, maybe don't think about yourself as something final. But if you want to change something, if you don't like the way your brain interprets life, then like, yeah, become hyper aware and edit things and change things about your reactions, and then you can go back to being kind of like not really thinking that much about yourself. Because that's also the thing. Just because you're hyper aware of yourself right now doesn't mean that you're going to be like this for the rest of your life, you know? And so you can also use it in some sort of way, because you can be like, okay, you know what? I noticed that I'm not really enjoying my life. I have emotional reactions that I don't like. I have some thoughts about, I don't know, situations or people or future or something, and I don't really like the thoughts that I have in my head. So like, let me become hyper aware for like, I don't know, a year or two. I'm going to become hyper aware. I'm going to edit the things that I want to edit, and then I'm going to start concentrating on living life again. I think that this is totally doable. And I think that in some sort of way, maybe therapy is something like that, you know. You go to therapy for some time, you become hyper aware of yourself, you change the things, and then you start living your life again, you know. It's therapy is also kind of like this edit mode. And so yeah, I don't know. I feel like, you can use things like this. I don't really think that it's necessarily bad to be hyper aware. You just kind of have to notice what it actually does. Like, what purpose does it serve, Because if the purpose of your hyper awareness is just to create some sort of like a stable image, like a final image about yourself, maybe not really good, because like that's just not really possible anyway. But if you want to like edit things in yourself, then I think that it's fine, and it works really well. So yeah, so I don't know, I guess it's kind of like you just have to navigate it. So yeah, then again, what do I know? Not much. So don't take my words as some sort of wisdom or something like that. This is just my observation, but like I don't have any degree and any sort of like, brain stuff or anything like this. So I'm just literally talking from my own experience. Yeah, and it's probably not going to apply to everyone, but this is just something that I kind of noticed. So yeah, I hope that I'm not boring you or something. And so going back to the presentation, we now learn the next thing about the underground man, which is that he pretends to take offense and fall in love just to kind of amuse himself somehow. But I don't think that he really pretends, because it is kind of weird, because basically he kind of like starts off by pretending, and then he actually experiences the thing that he pretends to do. So like, falling in love, for example, he kind of like pretends to fall in love, but then he actually does fall in love. The thing is though that deep in his heart, he doesn't really believe in the emotions that he feels, and he kind of mocks them. And then the underground man further explains why he pretends like this, and it turns out that it's because of boredom and his inability of action. After that, he goes back for a moment to the topic of the normal active man versus the conscious man, and he figures that the active man is stupid because he quickly finds a cause to act. So, for example, when someone wrongs the active man, he quickly takes revenge, therefore his primary cause is justice. But the conscious man overthinks his motives to the point where he's not able to act, as after a while he's not sure about anything anymore. And then he concludes all of that by writing that perhaps he considers himself an intelligent man only because all his life he hasn't been able to begin or finish anything. And so now after that we get to the last point in this part of his diary, where he writes that inertia and laziness are actually two different things. And he actually laments here that it would be so much better if he had done nothing simply from laziness. Then he would respect himself, because that would mean that he was at least capable of being lazy. And then he gets into this big vision of how his life would look like if he were a sluggard, and he concludes that if he were one, then he would find pleasure in everything sublime and beautiful, he would live a nice life, and then he would die with dignity. But those are of course just his golden dreams. Following that, we now move to the last section of the first part of the book, and this one is all about the underground man's theories about the world. And the first point here is that a man consciously acts against his own advantage. And the underground man comes up to this conclusion after complaining about some people who think that if only humans were enlightened and understood their nature, they would for sure do what's right. But the underground man believes that when you look at the real world and not just some ideas that you have in your head, then you quickly realize that people often do exactly what's not right fully consciously, even if it works to their disadvantage. And after writing this, the underground man begins to overthink what even is human advantage. And I can tell you that like after reading this book, I am so tired of overthinking, because I know that I do it a lot with ideas. I don't really do it with like my life, but when it comes to ideas, yeah. But then we eventually get to his second point, which is that the rules of logic cannot predict human behavior. And as an example, he talks about Buckle's theory, which is that through civilization, humanity becomes softer and less bloodthirsty, which sounds perfectly logical, but when you actually look at humanity, you quickly realize that it's not true at all, since even in highly civilized countries, blood is being spilled in streams. And he also comes to the conclusion that the only gain of civilization for mankind is the greater capacity capacity for variety of sensations and nothing more. And actually, through that, humans may start finding enjoyment in bloodshed, and in the end, humanity might become even more bloodthirsty than before. And then he actually makes an interesting point here, as he writes that even if we had a society built completely on reason, what if then a man would show up who would be reactionary and ironical, and who would have a desire to destroy everything rational and go back to following your own will? And he would definitely find followers because, as the Underground Man concludes, man everywhere and at all times, whoever he may be, has preferred to act as he chose and not in the least as his reason and advantage dictated. And so that's actually another point in the Underground Man's worldview, which is that free will is always more important to a human than reason. And then right after writing this, the Underground Man makes a point that his readers, us, think that free will doesn't exist. Kinda true. And so he writes that we basically think, ha ha ha, but you know there is no such thing as choice in reality, say what you like. You will interpose with a chuckle, you as in like us. Science has succeeded in so far analyzing man that we know already that choice and what is called freedom of will is nothing else than. And then he adds that once we discover a formula for all of our desires and how they develop, it's most likely that man will at once stop feeling desire completely. And then he will be transformed from a human being to an organ stop, because what even is a man without desires and free will? And in general, it seems that the idea of the lack of free will really scares the Underground Man, as he believes that once we discover that free will doesn't exist, there would be nothing left for us to do, since we would be able to predict the rest of our lives. And so then, as he writes this, he also adds, "You see, gentlemen, reason is an excellent thing. There's no disputing that. But reason is nothing but reason, and satisfies only the rational side of man's nature, while will is a manifestation of the whole life, that is, of the whole human life, including reason and all the impulses. And although our life, in this manifestation of it, is often worthless, yet it is life and not simply extracting square roots." And so for the Underground Man, choice is really the most important thing for mankind, as he concludes that even if we were to provide a man with everything that he needs, he would still do something bad just to prove that he has a choice, and therefore he's a human being and not a piano key. And so I don't know what you think about this, because like I, for example, don't believe in free will, and yes, I am Christian. Don't ask me how that works. Yeah, but I don't believe in free will, and like I just don't really see the logic behind it. I spoke about it once on the channel, maybe 2 times, I don't remember. And and also, not only that, I think that the Underground Man really would not like me, because like not only do I not believe in free will, I also kinda do the thing that he was talking about with the motives and everything. Like I really dissect my desires, because basically I think that whenever you want something, you don't actually want it. I think that you always want something else and not the thing that you want, but you think that you have to get the thing that you want because like that's the only way of satisfying yourself in some sort of way. So for example, because like I don't know, maybe that doesn't really make sense. If we take like an example of, for example, being infatuated with someone. When you are infatuated with someone, you think that you want this person, right? It's like, oh, this person is so amazing, whoa, 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 I want them. But the thing is that like, I believe that you don't actually want this person. I believe that you want the things that kind of like come with this person. So maybe, and I'm just going to give you like the simplest thing, because like the motives for being with someone else, everyone has different ones, and sometimes it gets very complicated if you have some sort of like traumas or something. So, I'm not saying that every sort of infatuation is like this, but I'm giving you like the simplest one. So I think that the simplest one is that you want to be loved and you want to be accepted. And that's actually what you want, you don't want the person you want to be loved and accepted, and your brain basically thinks that getting together with this person that you're infatuated with is the only way for you to actually get this love and acceptance that you want, you know? And so, you know, you see the logic behind it. Like, it's like you don't actually want to be with this person. Like, you kind of want to be with this person, but the thing is that you actually want love and acceptance, and the person is just like a bridge to get there, kind of. So like there are so many ways to get love and acceptance, and it doesn't have to be the person. Yeah, I don't know. Now I feel like I just turned into the underground man with the overthinking bit. And also when it comes to this motive, like, of course, being loved and accepted is not the only thing. Yeah, there's so many reasons why you would want to get together with someone. And sometimes you're just horny. So there's really, you know, I just decided to pick being loved and accepted because I think that this is like the most normal one, maybe. But I don't know. Is this really, why would that be normal actually? The most natural. No, the most natural would be horny though. The most godly one, that's the being loved and accepted, is the most godly motive. Okay, whatever. So yeah, I feel like the underground man would really not like me because not only do I dissect my desires like this, but I also kind of fulfill them in a sense. And I think that this is like such a great cheat code in life, because like really whenever you want something, just think about what you actually want and then like search for it in your like proximity or something. I don't know how to say it. Like, because most of the things that you want, you can actually fulfill them right now, today. You don't really have to get this like big goal to fulfill them. So many things you can just kind of fulfill right now. You just have to find a different way for it. Then again, I'm just talking about my own experience. So this is not anything like, you know, scientific or anything. I'm just kind of talking about my observations of life, and yeah, and this really works for me. Now, following that, we get to the next idea that the underground man has, and it's that creative process is more important than the end result. So he starts by writing that a man is a creative animal predestined to engage in engineering to make new roads wherever they may lead, as the process of making them is more important than the destination itself. And so a man really is a comical creature, as he loves the process of attaining, but does not quite like to have attained something. Then after that, the underground man starts writing about suffering, and he actually makes a couple of points about it. First one is that man is sometimes passionately in love with suffering. Second one is that man will never truly reject suffering, that is chaos and destruction. And the reason for this is that suffering is the sole source of consciousness. And so we reach the last point here on the presentation, which is that consciousness will always be more important to a human than a reason. And so those are the man's theories, but now we move back to his room where we see him writing his diary, and as he keeps writing, he suddenly concludes that even though in the beginning he said that he envies the normal man, now that he thinks about it, he actually wouldn't want to be in his place. And not only that, but he concludes here that the conscious inactivity is so much better than anything else. But then right after he writes this, he adds, "Oh, but even now I'm lying. I'm lying because I know myself that it is not underground that is better, but something different, quite different, for which I'm thirsting, but which I cannot find." And then he also adds that it would be so much better if he believed in anything of what he had just written, but there's not even one single word that he really believes. And then he kind of gets into this like dialogue between himself and the audience, as for example, he's like, "Well, you could ask me why then I have written all this." And he would answer that he's been underground for 40 years without anything to do, and so he got pretty bored. And then the audience would probably say that it's shameful and humiliating that he thirsts for life and tries to settle the problems of life with logic alone. And then the audience would probably continue criticizing him, pointing how much of a hypocrite he is by saying things like, "You declare that you are afraid of nothing, and at the same time try to aggregate yourself in your own good opinion. You declare that you are gnashing your teeth, and at the same time, you try to be witty so as to amuse us. You know that your witticism is not witty, but you are evidently well satisfied with their literary value. You might perhaps have really suffered, but you have no respect for your own suffering. You might have sincerity, but you have no modesty. But then, right after that, the underground man writes that he has actually made up all the things that were said just now, and it's actually the only thing that he has invented in his life. And then he makes a point here that he's writing this diary only for himself, even though he constantly addresses his readers. But he would actually never publish this diary, as he's about to make some serious confessions here, confessions that are never printed nor given to other people to read. Then he explains a bit more, saying that maybe he imagines an audience on purpose, just so that he may be dignified while he writes. And on top of that, he wants to write down his memories instead of simply recalling them in his mind, because there's just something more impressive about putting them on paper. And besides, he'll be able to criticize himself better and maybe even improve his writing style. And this is actually getting so exhausting that he's constantly just over-explaining himself like this. Which, like, I know that I sometimes do it, and, like, trust me, I am so tired of it. Like, really, if you are an overthinker, read this book, because you're going to be so tired of overthinking and over-explaining that you're just going to stop. Because, like, what? Why? No. And then the underground man writes that recently some memories have been really haunting him, and so he needs to write them down so that maybe he will get rid of them. And besides, he's of course bored and he really doesn't have anything better to do anyway. And then as he stares out of the window, he notices that the snow is falling today, and that reminds him of a specific event that he's not able to forget about. And with that, we begin the second part of the book, which is called Apropos of the Wet Snow. And so we begin here with a fragment that reads, I was only 24. My life was even more gloomy, ill-regulated, and as solitary as that of a savage. I made friends with no one and positively avoided talking, and buried myself more and more in my hole. At work in the office, I never looked at anyone. And so let's now go to a slide about his early life. We're going to have the slide, this is like the last slide in the presentation, and then after that we're going to have some events from his life, and we're going to have more like normal, usual scenes. And so here in his memories, because he's also going to be younger in the scenes, right now he's 24 years old, he lives a very solitary life, and he also has this constant feeling that everyone around despises him. But then at the same time, as he thinks about this, he realizes that one of the clerks in his job had a very repulsive face, and another clerk always had a very smelly uniform, and yet they were both totally unaware that anyone could look at them with repulsion, and even if someone did, they probably wouldn't mind anyway. And so because of all of this, the underground man realizes that it's not really that everyone around was repulsed by him, it's more like his own vanity and the high standards that he set for himself that were making him repulsed by himself, and he just projected that feeling onto others. And so that's actually our next point, which is that the underground man despises himself for setting impossibly high standards. And then he kind of elaborates on that as he writes that he hates his face, and he always thought that there was something disgusting in it, and so in order to make the situation at least a bit better, he always tried to look noble. And he even thought to himself, my face might be ugly, but let it be lofty, expressive, and above all, extremely intelligent. And his face was not the only thing that he hated, as he also hated all of his fellow clerks, yet at the same time he was always a bit afraid of them, and sometimes he thought more highly of them than of himself. And so he was basically just switching between despising them and thinking that he's better than them. And on top of that, he started to think that he's unlike anyone else, and he even thought, I am alone and they are everyone. And then as he's in the middle of describing his life, he suddenly begins to write about the romantic movement. And his main point here is that Russians never had those transcendental romantics like Germans, for example, or even worse, the French. And the reason for that is in Russia there are of course no fools, which is basically common knowledge, according to the Underground Man and Dostoevsky. And so the romantics of Russia were of course completely different than the European ones, as their main goal was to understand everything and to see everything and to see it often incomparably more clearly than our most realistic minds see it. And so the Russian romantic was always paying attention to everything practical and useful, like money for example, but at the same time he viewed all of those practical things through the lens of volumes of lyrical poetry. And so he was basically just kind of romanticizing his life. Then after this break for the romantic movement, the Underground Man goes back to writing about his own life, and he writes that he spent most of his life at home reading, and he was always trying to suppress his emotions with some sort of external sensations, but of course the only external sensation he had was reading. And it was helpful because at times it was exciting him, giving him pleasure and pain, but sometimes it bore him tremendously. And because of this boredom, he eventually plunged into dark, underground, loathsome wickedness of the lowest kind. And so at night in solitude, he indulged in his filthy vice with a feeling of shame that never quite left him and only caused him to fear being seen or recognized whenever he was out. And now at this point we actually get our first scene as we see the Underground Man walking down the street during the night. Here he's passing by a tavern and he sees some men fighting inside when suddenly one of them is thrown out of the window. And normally he would probably just be disgusted by this situation, but for some reason this time he was in such a bad mood that he actually envied the guy that was thrown out of the window. And so he went inside the tavern thinking that maybe someone will fight with him as well and throw him out. But somehow nothing really happened, and that made him feel even worse as he now felt like he was not good enough to be thrown out. And not only that, but as he was standing in the tavern, he didn't realize that he was blocking up the way and that an officer wanted to pass. And so the officer then took him by the shoulders and, without a word or explanation, moved him from where he was standing to another spot and then passed by as though he had not noticed him. And that made the Underground Man furious, as he would be able to forgive violence, but he could not forgive being ignored like that. And so, full of resentment, he went out of the tavern and headed home. And after that, he often met that officer in the street, and every single time he stared at him with hatred and spite, even though he was never really sure whether the officer even recognized him. And that then continued for several years. And during those years, the Underground Man's resentment grew even stronger, and he actually started to stalk the officer a bit as he figured out his name. Then one time he followed him to his flat and then also paid the porter to learn some more information about him. And another time he even wrote a satire on this officer where he unmasked his villainy. And then yet another time he was so determined to challenge him to a duel that he composed a very charming letter that he thinks was so sublime and beautiful that if only the officer could understand its beauty, he would probably just fling himself on his neck and offer his friendship. Just like a very enemies to lovers type of a deal. And yeah, it really kinda is, because then the Underground Man writes that he would actually love it, because then the officer could protect him with his higher rank. But unfortunately, the Underground Man was not able to give him the letter, as at this point it was already 2 years after the events from the tavern, and so he realized that it would probably be pretty ridiculous of him. But then he eventually came up with with an amazing idea, which was to go to the most busy street where he most often saw the officer. And now the thing with this whole situation here is that the officer always steps aside for generals and people of high rank, but when it comes to people like the underground man, he usually just walks straight ahead as though there's nothing but an empty space before him. And of course, it always fills the underground man with resentment, as even on the street they are not equals. And so eventually they found themselves back on the street, and even though the underground man was always stepping aside for the officer, he decided that this time things will be different. And he really prepared himself for this moment, as he even rehearsed it a bunch of times, and then also bought himself a pair of black gloves and a decent hat, even though he really shouldn't because he didn't really have the money for it. But he still did that just in case of emergency or if the situation blew up into a public scandal. And so you can really see how much he thought that doing basically anything could blow up to a big thing, which is kind of like a theme for the underground man, that he rarely takes action, and when he does take action, he thinks that it's going to be like this big thing, you know? He really thinks that his actions bring a lot of consequences, when in reality that's really not the case usually. And so all ready and prepared, he went back on the street and he just kept overthinking this whole thing, as he even prayed for God to give him determination. But then as the underground man and the officer were coming close to each other, his courage failed him and the officer once again stepped over him. And so after that happened, the underground man was ill, feverish and delirious for the whole night, and he eventually made up his mind not to carry out his plan. And so with that in mind, he decided to go back to the Nevsky Street for the last time. But then once he came closer to the officer, he unexpectedly changed his mind. He closed his eyes and then they ran into each other, shoulder to shoulder, and passed on a perfectly equal footing. But the officer actually didn't react at all, and he just kept walking, but the underground man of course believes that he was just pretending. But that doesn't really matter for him anyway, as the only important thing is that the underground man was able to put himself publicly on an equal footing with the officer and was finally avenged for everything. Following that, we learn another interesting thing about the underground man, and it's that he was always a terrible dreamer, and sometimes when life was extra unbearable, he was able to dream for even 3 months without a break. And in those dreams, he was of course always a hero, and it's almost like he sort of believed that by some miracle or external circumstance, his life would suddenly change and he really would become the hero that he was in his imagination. Triumphant? Triumphant. Oh my gosh, how many words do I have to check here? Triumphant. Pronunciation. Triumphant. Why is English like this? It's so weird because, like, you know, in Polish, people say that Polish is hard. It's not. Because in Polish, you just read words how they are. You don't, like, you just read them. You don't really do anything, like, you just read the words. It's just very straightforward. Polish is very, very straightforward. You have a word, you read it, you're done. And with English, it's always like, there's always just something, and the words don't look how they sound, and it's so confusing. I still like English, but it's just that sometimes the pronunciation is just so weird. And English is also very, like, it always has this, like, this vibe. You know what I mean? Okay, whatever. And then we get a little sample of his dreams and imaginations, and it reads as: I, for instance, was triumphant over everyone. Everyone, of course, was in dust and ashes, and was forced spontaneously to recognize my superiority. And I forgave them all. I was a poet and a grand gentleman. I fell in love. I came in for countless millions and immediately devoted them to humanity, and at the same time I confessed before all the people my shameful deeds, which of course were not merely shameful, but had in them much that was sublime and beautiful, something in the Manfred style. But the Underground Man also reveals here that he was not able to stay in those dreams for more than 3 months, as after that time he always felt the need to plunge back into society. And for the Underground Man, plunging back into society meant visiting his superior at the office, Anton Antonich Sietochkin. And so now we learn a couple of things about Sietochkin here, and the first thing is that he was the only permanent he was the only permanent friend that the Underground Man had. And the second one is that Sietochkin had 2 young daughters, and the Underground Man always felt very uncomfortable around those girls because they were always giggling, and so of course he thought that they were laughing at him. Other than that, Sietochkin always liked to meet up with 2 or 3 of his other friends and just talk about things like business, salaries, and promotions. And whenever the Underground Man joined those conversations, he always sat in silence like a fool and listened to the men without really knowing what to say to them. But still, he always believed that it was pleasant and good for him, but of course every single time he came back home from those meetings, he no longer felt the need to be social. But Sietochkin was not the only friend that the Underground Man had, as there was also Simonov. And now Simonov was his friend back from the school days, and he was really the only one with whom he was still in contact, and that's because the Underground Man really despises his childhood, and so as soon as he got out of school, he caught contact with everyone, but not with Simonov, who was rather quiet and was never standing out in school. And well, the 2 of them actually had some soulful moments together, but it didn't really last long, and it actually seems that Simonov is rather uncomfortable at any memories of the past. And in general, it seems that he has some sort of aversion for the Underground Man, but the Underground Man is not really sure of that, and so he just never stopped visiting him. And with this information, we move to one another scene from the past. Because one day, the Underground Man could no longer stand his solitude, and because he was not able to visit Sietochkin on that day, he decided to visit Simonov for the first time after a year of not seeing each other. And so the Underground Man then went to Simonov's place, but unfortunately he did not find him alone here, but in the company of 2 of his school fellows. They were discussing something very important here, and strangely, at first, they didn't even seem to notice the man coming in, and when they finally did, they looked at him as if he were just a fly. And the Underground Man felt really miserable here, as he even writes in his diary, "I knew, of course, that they must despise me now for my lack of success in the service, and for my having let myself sink so low, going about badly dressed and so on, which seemed to them a sign of my incapacity and insignificance." Which we of course know that it's not necessarily true, because remember that before he also wrote that he always thought that people at the office when he was working were disgusted by him, which was not necessarily true. It was not people despising him, but it was him despising himself because of the high standards that he had for himself. Eventually, the man sat down next to them and began listening to their conversation. Simonov, Zverkov. Pro tip, the page howtopronounce.com is not really that good, I think. Maybe sometimes it has good pronunciation, but not always. It's so much, there's like a much better site is Forvo, because they actually have people that speak the language, say the words. So yeah, much better site. Oh, zvier is actually a Russian word for animal? Zvier. Oh, that would make sense actually. Wait, let me check. Russian. Zvier. Zvier. Beast. Interesting. This is so interesting. Beast, wild animal, savage. Interesting choice of name. Zvier. Yeah, that makes sense. In Polish we have zwierz, so I guess yeah, that's pretty similar. When I was studying Polish, we were actually studying like a, how do you even say it? Okay, wait, what? We were studying 2 languages actually. Proto-Slavic Proto-Slavic or Common Slavic. And then we were also studying Old Slavic. So when you learn languages like this, you start to realize that, you know, Slavic languages are very, very similar. We basically had like one Slavic language, and then it just kind of, you know, things started changing depending on the geography, I guess. It was one language at one point. And so we have fun things like this. There's many words like this, actually. So many times it's just a matter of vowels, really, because you also have, like, for example, a road in Russian is doroga, and in Polish it's droga. So it's just, you know, they just have like an additional O there, doroga instead of droga. Yeah, it's kind of fun. So yeah, zwierz, as far as I see here, zwierz in Russian is also kind of more like, it's not just an animal, it's more like a beast, you know, it's more like a wild beast. It's not just a normal animal. Okay, whatever, because we lost the plot, or I lost the plot. Sorry that I'm getting you, accusing you as well. It's just me. And so they were all talking here about a farewell dinner that they wanted to arrange for their friend Zverkov, an officer in the army who was soon going away to a distant province. And now, surprise, surprise, it turns out that the underground man had always hated Zverkov for the same reason that everyone else loved him, which was that when he was younger, he was a pretty and playful boy. And what really irritated the underground man was that Zverkov was always bad at school, and yet he still left with a good certificate just because he was popular. And so the underground man hated Zverkov for the self-confident tone in his voice, his handsome but stupid face, which interestingly the underground man also adds here that he would actually prefer this one over his intellectual one. And he also hated Zverkov because he was constantly talking about his future conquests of women and also the duels he would constantly be fighting. And of course, after the school ended, Zverkov was doing pretty well. He was successful both in the service and with women, and he was still hanging out with his old friends from school. Even though the underground man is convinced that the guys here couldn't possibly consider themselves on an equal footing with Zverkov. Which is kind of like strange, because the underground man really has this sort of like, I don't know, this like hierarchy of people, and it's like, you know, if you are better than I don't know exactly, to be honest. I don't know, it's kind of weird, because it's like, of course, sometimes you can say that like some people are in some sort of way superior, but it doesn't really say anything about them as a person. It's sort of like, you know how you go to your job and of course you have a boss and your boss is your superior in that context, but that doesn't mean that they are like better humans. It just means that in this context they are superior, but you can still talk to them like normal humans. Or like, I don't know, I guess, okay, sometimes you have to match the tone or something, but you know, at the end of the day, a human is a human, no matter what. Even if you have some sort of like hierarchies when it comes to like social hierarchies and everything, a human is a human. A human is always going to be a human. Or maybe I see it like that. I actually struggle with it sometimes, because like I have this thing where I just see humans as humans, because I feel like I could literally talk to anyone on this earth and I would just feel like I'm talking to a human no matter what, even if I were to like speak to a queen or something. And maybe that's not possible because she's dead, because like at the end of the day I'm still speaking to a human. Like I recognize like a role that's very, very important and very special and everything. I do recognize that. But like at the end of the day, outside of your role, you are a human. I have no idea, maybe I should not be like this. But the underground man really sees the roles that people play as something very, very important, I think. And he really believes in it. And I think that's kind of the thing. There are some people that see the world as the underground man, but they are actually superior than others, you know, on like a more superior role. And that's kind of, they don't want to be treated like a human because they probably have very big egos, and if you treat them as a human, it's going to be like, oh, do you know who I am? It's like, yeah, I know you're a human. Whatever, because now I'm just rambling. Let's go back. Now we learn a bit more about Simonov's friends. One of them is called Ferfichkin, and the underground man really doesn't like him, as we get such a beautiful description here. It reads, Of Simonov's two visitors, one was Ferfitchkin, a Russianized German, a little fellow with the face of a monkey, a blockhead who was always deriding everyone, a very bitter enemy of mine from our days in the lower forms, a vulgar, impudent, swaggering fellow who affected a most sensitive feeling of personal honor. Though of course he was a wretched little coward at heart. The other man here is called Trudili Lubov, and of course he's in no way remarkable. Just a tall young fellow in the army with a cold face, only capable of thinking of promotions and worshipping success of every sort. But he's actually related to Zverkov, which makes him a bit more important in this company. And so as the guys here were talking about the dinner that they wanted to arrange for Zverkov, they were like, okay, so each person is going to give 7 rubles, except Zverkov, of course, and so that makes 21 rubles. And to this, the underground man suddenly was like, no, that's actually not true, because if you count me in, then that's going to be 27 rubles, 28 rubles. Math is hard. And we actually learn a bit about what was going through his head as he said it, as we get a fragment that reads, "It seemed to me that to invite myself so suddenly and unexpectedly would be positively graceful, and that they would all be conquered at once and would look at me with respect." But that of course didn't happen, because right after that, Simonov just asked him whether he wants to join them, and he didn't even look at him. And the underground man of course insisted, saying that he was an old school fellow of Zverkov as well, and he really decided not to give up on this idea. Even though the guys were really not excited about this, as Trudili Lubov even said that the underground man had never been on good terms with Zverkov, and as soon as the underground man heard this, his voice got all shaky. He said that no one has the right to form an opinion about that, and that maybe this is exactly his reason for wanting to pay for the dinner. And so Simonov eventually agreed, even though his friends were really not excited about that, with Ferfitchkin complaining that it's not going to be any sort of like official gathering, kinda implying that the underground man was really not welcome. But then both friends eventually left, leaving Simonov and the underground man alone, with Simonov looking at him with annoyance. Then Simonov asked him whether he would pay him now, and in that moment the underground man actually remembered that he owed him some money. And then after some awkward minutes together, the underground man eventually left. And right after he did, he became furious and he started cursing himself for wanting to pay for a pig like Zverkov. And at first he thought that maybe he should just send Simonov a note saying that he won't come, especially considering that at that moment he only had 9 rubles and he had to give 7 of them to his servant Apollon. But still, eventually he decided to go to the dinner anyway and just simply not pay his servant. Following that, we learned that the same night the underground man had some terrible dreams, which was not really a surprise to him, as all evening before he couldn't think about anything other than the memories of his miserable days at school. And so now we learn a bit about his early life, and he really didn't have it easy from the very beginning, as it looks like he was probably an orphan, because he writes that in his childhood he was completely dependent on some of his distant relatives, who constantly reproached him, then sent him to school and never contacted him again. Then in school, his classmates were very quick to mock him, as he was different than them, and so he quickly started to hate them and just basically shut himself from everyone. And then soon he started to consider his classmates as inferior to himself, because they were not thinking about things deeply and instead had simple conversations and did not understand real life. On top of that, the most important thing for them was their rank, and they also laughed at everything that was just but was looked down upon. And so the underground man of course didn't really want to be friends with them, but he did have this deep desire to humiliate them. In order to do that, he forced his way all the way to the top, read books none of his classmates could read, and understood things they had not even heard of. And well, in the mind of the underground man, his classmates were of course very morally impressed, but remember that we don't know that for sure, because still he's writing everything from his own perspective. Eventually his classmates stopped mocking him, but they were still pretty hostile to him, even when after some time the underground man actually tried to befriend them as he got pretty lonely. And interestingly, once the underground man had a friend, but he was incredibly nasty to him and he basically wanted to have full control over him. And so the underground man had separated his friend from everyone else and brought him to tears. But when his friend devoted himself completely to him, he began to hate him and then eventually basically discarded him. Following that, we go back to his memories about the dinner for Zverkov, and we learn that very early in the morning he jumped out of the bed with excitement, just as if some radical change in his life was coming. And what's very interesting here is that we learned that any sort of external event, however trivial, always made him feel as though some radical change in his life was coming. And yeah, I think that it's certainly true that, you know, when you don't really do much and you just think a lot and imagine a lot, you start to think that everything that you do is very big and special, or like or just like any sort of events, you know, not even something that you do, just any sort of event is big, because like if you don't have any events, then any sort of event is big, basically. The reality is never like this, I think. And actually, in order to, like, you know, make some changes in your life, you really have to work hard. Yeah, it's not like you're just going to change like this and whoa. No, life usually doesn't change like that. Usually you have to actually work for it. I can tell you that with this channel I also had that. I think that, you know, I was a person that was never really posting much on social media, just because I just kind of didn't really get into it. Like, I didn't really have some profound reason for that. I was just always like a silent watcher, viewer. And so then when I jumped to YouTube all of the sudden, which is also kind of like a great idea, you know. But yeah, I can tell you that when I posted my first video, I thought that it's going to be something, maybe not like overnight success or something like that, but I thought that people are going to see it, basically, you know, because it's, when you're not really posting, it almost feels like if you just post something on the internet, then people are going to see it. That's not the reality. It really is not the reality. You really have to work hard for people to see your content, and it's really not as simple as posting something, which is actually so fun, because now I notice that it's not that serious. I can just kind of yap here and you know, some of you are going to watch it, but it's not going to be like half of the world or something. And I feel like even if you do have a lot of viewers, I don't know, it's like a specific niche and people know you in this niche, but when you go outside of your niche, people just don't really know about you, which I find it to be very, very nice. I don't know why, but like I wanted this channel to work. At the same time, for some, like, I still kind of don't want people to think about me, in a sense. I don't know. I want you to think about the ideas that I present here, not about me. Even when I talk about myself, please don't think about me. So before leaving his house, the underground man was of course overthinking every single detail, as he figured that he probably shouldn't be the first one to arrive, and he also polished his shoes 2 times and complained a lot about his clothes being all old and worn out. And in general, he was overwhelmed with a deep feeling of shame before going out, and he was obsessively imagining everyone welcoming him with cold resentment. And what was the worst for him is that he knew that this whole meeting will be completely unliterary and basic, and he just simply couldn't handle it. And then of course for a moment he thought that maybe he should just stay at home, but of course he realized that he simply has to go just to dominate them all and make Zverkov ashamed. And so the underground man man then prepared himself to leave and then slipped between Apollon and the door and left. And it's also noted here that Apollon has been expecting his payment for the month, but he didn't want to be the first one to mention it. Then the underground man spent his last half ruble on a high-class sledge and he drove up in grand style to Hotel de Paris. And now, as soon as he arrived, he noticed that not only was he the first one to arrive, but the table wasn't even ready yet. And after looking around and asking the waiters, he learned that the dinner had been ordered not for 5, but for 6 o'clock. That of course made the underground man completely ashamed, and so he just sat down and began to wait. Eventually, the men arrived all together at 6, and the underground man was actually very overjoyed to see them because he saw them as his saviors, and even forgot for a moment that he should rather show resentment. And of course, immediately the underground man concentrates on Zverkov, who walked in ahead of others and was all happy and laughing. That is until he saw the underground man. Because as soon as he saw him, he walked up to him, became very official and just shook hands with him in a friendly but not overly friendly fashion. And of course, the only thing the underground man was able to concentrate on was Zverkov's superiority to him. Eventually, Zverkov began to talk and he said that he was actually very surprised to hear that the underground man wanted to join them, as he never seemed to like them. And interestingly, Zverkov also added that they are not as terrible as he believes them to be. After that, Trudilyubov asked him whether he's been waiting for long, and the underground man replied, visibly irritated, that he arrived at 5 o'clock just as they agreed yesterday. To which Trudilyubov then asked Simonov whether he had told the underground man that they decided to change the hour of the meeting. And Simonov replied, simply saying that he forgot, but he did not show any sign of regret, and then without apologizing, he just went off to order some food. And what's the worst for the underground man is that this whole situation was very funny to Zverkov, who then started to pity him. And as you might imagine, that was just purely awful for the underground man, so then he cried out that it was not funny at all, and that it wasn't his fault, but other people's. And Trudilyubov actually agreed with him, saying that it was simply rude not to inform him. After that, Simonov came back, told everyone to sit down as everything was ready, and then he explained that he just simply didn't know the underground man's address, and so he just simply didn't know how to contact him about the hour. But because Simonov kept avoiding looking at him, the underground man eventually figured that Simonov definitely has to have something against him. So then eventually they all sat down, and in general, Zverkov was actually very nice here because he tried to cheer the man up as he saw how embarrassed he was. But the underground man was of course very nasty to him, and then he turned horribly red after saying what his salary was. And to this, Zverkov concluded that, well, it really wasn't that much, and Trudilyubov even added that it's actually pretty poor. And then Zverkov continued, saying that he noticed that the underground man has grown very thin. And so the underground man then eventually said that he imagines that it would be so much better to talk of something more intelligent, to which Ferfichkin was like, oh, are you intent to show off your intelligence? And the man answered that, well, that would be quite out of place here. And so to this, Zverkov cried out that it's really enough, and Trudilyubov added that they've all met here for a farewell dinner to a comrade, and the underground man invited himself in, and so he shouldn't disturb the general harmony. After that, Zverkov began telling some stories from his life, and everyone actually got into a pretty good mood, except the underground man, of course, who just sat in his chair, crushed and humiliated, with no one paying attention to him. And so he then thought to himself, good heavens, these are not the people for me, I thought. And what a fool I have made of myself before them. I let Ferfichkin go too far though. The birds imagine they are doing me an honor in letting me sit down with them. they don't understand that it's an honor to them and not to me. So the dinner continued, and as the guys were getting more nosy and cheerful, the underground man became completely annoyed with everyone. Eventually, Zverkov spoke about his close friend Prince Kola, an officer in the Hussars, and to this, the underground man was like, well, and yet this Kola did not come here tonight to see you off. The room, of course, went completely silent after this remark. Someone then told the underground man that he was definitely already drunk, and Zverkov looked at him as if he were an insect. And then Simonov filled up the glasses with champagne, and everyone raised their glasses, except for the underground man, of course. But no one really paid any attention to him, as everyone just drank their champagne and then began to kiss Zverkov, while the underground man did not even move, and his glass stood untouched before him. And eventually, the man said that he wants to make his own speech, and only then he will drink the champagne. And so he started, even though no one was really that excited about it, and he said that, well, first point is that he hates phrases and phrase mongers. The second point, he hates ribaldry and ribald talkers. And the third point, he loves justice, truth, and honesty. And then he finished his speech by saying, I love though, Monsieur Zverkov. I love true comradeship on an equal footing, and not, I love. But, however, why not? I will drink your health too, Mr. Zverkov. Seduce the Circassian girls, shoot the enemies of the fatherland, and to your health, Monsieur Zverkov. To this, Zverkov of course got pretty offended. He turned completely pale, while the other guys got very mad, yelling that the underground man should be punched just for saying something like this. But Zverkov stopped them, to which the underground man actually challenged one of the guys to a duel, but everyone just laughed at him for that, and they basically concluded that he has to be very drunk by now. Then Simonov said to himself that he will never forget himself for letting the underground man join them, while the underground man just began thinking to himself that he's pretty sure that everyone would be very happy if he went away, and so for that reason he will stay on purpose. And so they then continued to spend the time together. The guys later moved from the table to the sofa without inviting the underground man to join them. And of course, because of that, the underground man then began to wonder, why is it that everyone seems to like Zverkov so much, and in general he's so annoying here, because he then starts to walk up and down the room trying to pretend that he doesn't care about them at all, but at the same time he kept thumping with his heels on purpose just to make some noise in the room. But no one really paid any attention to him anyway, even though he continued to do it for quite some time, as he even got himself into some sort of like delirium. And then as the guys got ready to leave, the underground man was suddenly like, Zverkov, I ask for your friendship. I know that I insulted you. But Zverkov just interrupted him, and he was like, you insulted me? Well, you have to understand that there is no possibility that you could insult me. And after that, the guys left the room, leaving the underground man completely flustered. But before he was left completely alone, he actually managed to stop Simonov for a moment. And he just basically begged him for 6 rubles, which Simonov gave him. Then, after the guys left for good, the underground man decided that he has to follow them, and they shall all go down on their knees and beg for his friendship, or he will give Zverkov a slap in the face. And so, basically from this point on, the underground man became completely obsessed with this idea of slapping Zverkov. And in order to do that, he got into a sledge and set off to the place where the guys went, and basically for the whole journey, he was just overthinking every single detail, imagining that he will just simply walk in and slap Zverkov. And then he really kept overthinking, as then he was like, oh well, after I slap him, then we will definitely have a duel after that, and so now I have to think where I will get the pistols from and who will be my second and everything like that, which is just crazy because you can see that the underground man really just lives in his own imagination. It's like he didn't even do the thing and he already has this like elaborate vision of what's going to happen, and it's like, no. You don't know what the future holds. And he gets really into it because as he keeps imagining how his life is going to look like after he slaps Zverkov, he actually tears up a bit as we get a fragment that reads, "I was actually on the point of tears. Though I knew perfectly well at that moment that all this was out of Pushkin's Silvio and Lermontov's Masquerade. And all at once I felt horribly ashamed, so ashamed that I stopped the horse, got out of the sledge, and stood still in the snow in the middle of the street. The driver gazed at me, sighing and astonished." Eventually, the underground man got to the place where the guys went, and it turns out to be one of the millinery establishments, which were abolished by the police some time ago, because, well, by day it was a real shop, but at night you could go there for other purposes. So the underground man came in, but he didn't find anyone here but just Madame herself. And he actually got very happy about this because he felt as if he had been saved from death. And so after that, he looked around the room and he noticed a woman who came here just a moment ago. She was young, pale, and had this grave stare that immediately attracted the underground man. And so he began staring at her, noticing that her face seemed to be very good natured, even though she was not really that pretty. And so the underground man came up to her, but he also glanced into the mirror, where he noticed that his face was very off-putting, but he quickly figured that he actually kinda likes that he shall seem repulsive to her. Is it getting dark? It's so unfair. Currently, it's like, wait, how do you say it? Because in English you have those weird like PMs, AMs. So I can't just say that it's 14th hour. It's the 14th hour of the day. So I guess it's like 2 p.m. 2 p.m? Is it like 2? Yeah, 2 p.m. This is 2 p.m. and it's so dark. Why? Now, after that, we actually move a bit in time and we change the location as we find ourselves in a dark, narrow, and low-pitched room. And here, the underground man wakes up with a big headache, and as he looks around, he notices the woman from before laying next to him. Now, at this point, he mentions two things. The first one is that during those 2 hours they've been together, he did not say to her a single word, and the second one is that they of course were intimate with each other. Eventually he asked for her name, he learned that it's Liza, and then they had a rather uncomfortable conversation about the weather and also the fact that she's a 20-year-old Russian woman from Riga and that she's been working here for 2 weeks now. But then after revealing all of that, Liza is really not interested in answering more questions, and so eventually the underground man stops asking. But still, they continue to talk because the underground man really doesn't feel like leaving, and so they then spoke about a recent funeral of a woman of the same profession as Liza. And in general, the underground man was so incredibly nasty here, as he just basically kept trying to make Liza suffer by telling her that she will die, if not now, then later. And then also explaining that right now she was young, pretty, and fresh, but after another year of this life, her value will decrease. And after that happens, she will go to another lower house, then after a year to a third, and then lower and lower, and in 7 years she will come to a basement in the Haymarket. But to this she just said that, well, in that case, she shall just die. Die. I cannot fix this in my voice. It's also funny because like when I edit the video, I see how the sound looks like in the graph, and I always see this like literally it's just like and every single time I'm just like, oh my gosh. Oh my gosh, amazing. I don't know how to fix it though. Maybe I will someday. Okay, you know what? Because it's actually very dark now. I did it once in my Verger video. We're going to do something special right now. This time I have fire that works. First try. Okay. Work. Okay. Jesus. No, this is so annoying. I'm trying to be like softer or something like that, but I just cannot for the life of me. I always love those women who are like very feminine and very kind of like women like Lucy from Dracula, for example. I love women like this. They are so lovely, and you just want to spend time with them because you just feel good with them, you know? They're amazing. And I would love to be like this, but I'm not. And I tried to change it. Because, you know, on the channel, I always say like, you can change everything. And that is true. At the same time, I also said a bunch of times that change is sometimes hard. Yeah, me changing into a softer woman, that's really a challenge. It really is. Because my nature is just kind of, I don't know how to even explain it. Just very like, that's the feeling that I have for me. Kind of spiky or something. I want to be soft. Okay, I don't know if it works. Wait. Okay. No, I think that it works. Because now, dark. Now, yeah, kind of lighter. Okay. So it kind of works. Yeah, and you see what I mean? Even right now, I'm just like, wait, just giving you orders. Like, okay. Whatever. Okay, we're going back. And so after that, the underground man just kept asking her questions about her life, and he just kept saying that he's very sorry for her. But to that, Liza just said that there's no need for him to be sorry for her, which actually took him back a bit because he definitely expected a different answer after being so gentle with her. And then she said something that made him quite irritated because basically he asked her whether she thinks that she's on the right path, to which she just said that she doesn't think at all. And so he then tried his best to convince her that it's very important for her to think about her future, since there's still time for her to lead a normal life. But again, she was not really that excited because after all, it's not like all women who are married are happy. And after that exchange, the underground man got pretty emotional as he now was like, well, perhaps I'm even worse than you, but still, even if I come here and degrade myself, I'm not anyone's slave, but you are. And so he then elaborated a bit on this idea as he started to scare Liza that even if she later wants to break her chains, she won't be able to, as she now sold her soul to the devil. Then after that, the underground man just basically tried to manipulate her for some time, trying to figure out what tone to take in order to get to her. And so, for example, he was like, oh, I'm sure that someone had wronged you, because it's not likely for a girl like you to come here of her own inclination. But she didn't answer, and so to this, the man just started to talk about himself. And so he said that if he had a home from childhood, then maybe he wouldn't end up like this. And he also got here into this elaborate description of how much he would spoil his daughter if he had one, and how he would never allow her to marry. And to this, Liza just said that, well, some fathers are glad to sell their daughters instead of marrying them honorably. And of course, as soon as the underground man heard this, he was like, oh, so that's what it is. And so he then said that something like this can only happen in those accursed families when there's neither love nor God. And so he then continued saying that marriage is amazing, and that she will find out once she marries. And then he just basically went into this big ramble about marriage, trying to kind of get to Liza with those detailed descriptions of a happy wife with children. But he did not really succeed with that, as instead of getting emotional, Liza just asked him with irony in her voice, why is he speaking somehow like a book? That of course hurt him a bit, and so then he proceeded to just talk so incredibly much, and his main point was basically that Liza doesn't realize how terrible her life is going to be if she continues working here, and also that she's just a slave here, and that she's selling her soul, and that her love is not worth anything anymore, even though previously a man would be ready to face death just to get that love. And then he also told her about any potential lovers that she might have here, because Madame allows the women here to have lovers, but the underground man explained to Liza that even if she has one, she has to be aware that those men are just pretending, and that if she ever asked one of those men to marry her, then she would probably just get beaten and laughed at. And so then the underground man just kept trying to make her feel bad, trying to make her imagine how terrible her life is going to be, and he just basically kept repeating himself from before. And so he just repeats that she will eventually end up in the Haymarket, and then she will become diseased, and then she will die, and no one will cry after her. And then he eventually ended his speech with a fragment that reads, and I worked myself up to such a pitch that I began to have a lump in my throat myself, and all at once I stopped, sat up in dismay, and bending over apprehensively, began to listen with a beating heart. I had reason to be troubled. I mean, I said it. And I feel like we're going to end right now here for a moment because it's getting pretty dark and I don't know, the candle is kind of working, but you know, it's going to get darker in a moment and maybe it's not going to work anymore. So I have to finish the video tomorrow. It's almost the end though. This is actually so fun because like you just see one video. I record those videos in a couple of days. It takes days. It's not just me sitting and being like blah 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 and then you know like it's so much work, but it's fun. I've never had this much fun, I think. I don't know. It's so nice. This channel is so nice. And I do everything here myself. Like every single thing I do myself. And it's just, and I'm not saying it to brag. Like I do everything myself. I'm just saying it because like I love doing this channel and it's just so fun. So yeah, see you tomorrow. It was nice day of shooting. It's so unfair because like I'm just going to stop rambling and you're going to see the next part of the next day, and I actually have to go through the whole day and the whole morning and everything. But yeah, well, that was a nice day of filming, even though it got pretty dark. Oh, maybe like this would be nicer though. Well, that's too late now. So. Next day. This is so bad. I thought that, you know, I'm going to wait for the next day and it's going to be amazing. It's not amazing because for some reason the day doesn't want to start. I don't know what's the deal with that, but it's so dark. I guess it's just Poland. No wonder that Dostoevsky was so depressed all the time. Like when you live in a Slavic country, it's like this. Sometimes the day just doesn't start. I also had to switch on like the fake light. Disgrace. I don't know why I have such a beef with normal lights. I don't know. I just don't like them. My next video is going to be on the stranger. And let me tell you, his feelings when it comes to the big lights, I've never felt so seen. Yeah, never felt so seen, to be honest. Like I hate the big lights. They are just awful and I don't understand how you can live and function with big lights switched on. So yeah, but unfortunately had to switch on some things because the day is so dark, so it's going to look like this, which actually kind of fitting, I think, for the video, so that's not really that bad. Maybe it's even better. Okay, no, for real, let's start. And so as you can see in this moment, the underground man was rather distressed, but he was not the only distressed one, as upon looking at Liza, he saw her lying down with her face hidden in the pillow and her heart being torn. And she was really going through it as she was actually biting the pillow and also her hand, which then began to bleed. And in general, she just kept thrusting her fingers into her hair, holding her breath and clenching her teeth. Now, at first the underground man begged her to calm herself down, but he suddenly felt weak as well, and so almost in terror, he began to dress himself. Which I feel like this is actually very similar to Crime and Punishment and the conversation that Raskolnikov had with Sonia, which I feel like it really is similar because like Raskolnikov was also telling Sonia how horrible her life is going to be, and he was basically just making her miserable with his words, and she also later just broke down in tears. Interesting that a scene like this just stayed in Dostoevsky's mind for some reason. And so as the underground man was trying his best to dress himself, he figured that he's not really able to do that because the room was completely dark. So the underground man then lit up the room with a candle, and as soon as he did that, Liza sat up on the bed and gave him this half-insane smile. And so to this, the underground man sat down beside her, took her hands, and he was like, "Liza, my dear, I was wrong." And then he asked her to forgive him, gave her his address, and told her to visit him. She agreed, and as the underground man was ready to leave, she told him to wait, grabbed the candle, then ran off, and after a moment, she came back with a totally different expression than before. Because now, suddenly she was happy, full of life, and she had this innocence in her eyes. And she then gave him a piece of paper, which actually turned out to be a letter to her from a medical student, and not just a letter, but a flowery, extremely respectful love letter. And so Liza then explained that recently she had been to a dance somewhere in a private house of a family of very nice people who knew absolutely nothing of the way she makes money. And there she danced for the entire evening with a student, and they even spoke, thanks to which she learned that he had actually known her in old days when they were both children. And so he knew her and her parents, but he knew nothing of her current occupation. And so then, after some time, precisely 3 days ago, Liza got a letter from him. And to all of this, the underground man concludes, in his head, not out loud, that well, it's obvious that this letter is a great treasure to her, and that she only brought it to him to raise herself in his eyes. And then after that, the underground man decided not to say anything, and he just left, and then walked all the way to his home, despite the fact that the snow was falling in heavy flakes. But he didn't really care that much, as he was too exhausted, shattered, and bewildered to pay attention to anything. Following that, we find ourselves in his house, and we see him here waking up in the morning and lamenting that yesterday he suffered such an attack of womanish hysteria. Which is just amazing conclusion. I love when someone does something and like they don't want to recognize that it was them doing that, and so they just kind of like, no, that's a womanish hysteria. Imagine if every single time I got angry, I would be like, oh, you know what? I suffered such a male rage. Ew. And so as the underground man woke up here, he regretted giving Liza his address, but not for long, as soon he actually remembered about Zverkov, and so then he became totally obsessed with the idea of saving his reputation, both in the eyes of Zverkov and Simonov. And in order to do that, he decided to first repay what he borrowed the day before from Simonov, but because he didn't really have any money, he had to borrow some from Sietochkin, explaining that the night before he was at a farewell party to a comrade, a dear friend from his childhood. And so because his friend was so awesome, witty, charming, and had a great career, they drank a lot. And so then, after he got the money, he came back home and wrote a letter to Simonov. In it, he blamed himself for everything that had happened, stated that he was already drunk when the guys arrived, and asked Simonov to convey his explanations to everyone else, especially to Zverkov. And as he describes this letter in his notes, he begins to praise himself for keeping this letter in a very light and almost careless tone, just as if he was not completely crushed by the day before. And he even thought to himself that there was this aristocratic playfulness about all of this. After that, he gave the letter to Apollon and told him to get it to Simonov, while the underground man decided to go for a walk, but instead of calming down as he intended, he just kept feeling worse, just as if some crime was laying on his conscience. And so he later came back to his place, but from this point on, he could only worry about Liza and whether she would come to visit him. And so then he, of course, started to overthink everything, as suddenly he became very conscious of the way his place looked like. And he also started to imagine that Apollon will surely insult Liza, and he won't be able to do anything about it. Then he feared that once again he'll be forced to put on that dishonest lying mask, and right after he came to this conclusion, he added, "Why dishonest? How dishonest? I was speaking sincerely last night. I remember there was a real feeling in me too. What I wanted was to excite an honorable feeling in her. Her crying was a good thing. It will have a good effect." Just like, I hate when people do this. It's like, I'm going to make you feel a feeling. I don't know why I don't like it. I don't know what it is, but like it irritates me so much, because it's just like, why can't you just speak to me like a normal person? Like, why do you have to influence my emotions? I don't get it. Like, I really don't like it. No, because I feel like I don't really like it because people like this usually have some problems with control. It's almost like, you know, I have to control everything. Like, the world has to look how I want it to look, whatever. I feel like with people like this, like people like the underground man, who are very like controlling, and they are just like, you know, oh, I'm going to make you feel blah 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 blah. You just have to ignore them. That's the best way of dealing with people like this, because if you start to get angry at them and you answer the things that they're telling you and everything, you're going to basically like start the game that they want to play with you. And so, but if you ignore them and you don't, like, you just, you know, just don't notice that and just go about your life, they lose all the power and they lose all the control. They literally cannot do anything now. For people like this, I feel like the only way that they can kind of like control you, because that's kind of the thing, like people like the underground man, they are kind of like manipulative in the sense that they want to make you feel bad, but at the same time they are so I really hate to say that word, but they are so weak in a sense, because they are, like, the underground man is extremely weak in the sense that he's very self-conscious, he's just so fragile. Oh yeah, maybe that's the better word. He's very fragile. And so he doesn't really, like, he wants to have control because he doesn't actually have any control. And so, like, with people like this, the only way that they can kind of control you is if they invoke any sort of, like, emotions in you. And usually those are emotions like shame. I think that usually it's shame, actually. Like shame, embarrassment, maybe sadness, anger, but I feel like shame is the biggest one, you know? Like, they really want to make you feel ashamed. Maybe because they are ashamed of everything that they do. And so, and they also believe that, you know, if they experience shame like this, then you also have to experience shame like this. And so when everything makes them ashamed, they think that, you know, if they shame you, then you're going to be like them, essentially. And when you kind of make them realize that it's not going to be the case, that they can try to shame you and you're just not going to feel the shame because you just won't, because you're not so easily ashamed of everything, they kind of lose the power. Like, they literally just don't have any power over you, because the only way that they can have power is if they shame you. And you can see it on the internet, I think, as well. Like, notice how many times people just essentially want to put shame on you, or like make you feel shame, you know? So many times on the internet I see it, and when you start to see it, this mechanism or something, you know, so don't even pay attention to what people are writing, just pay attention to what is actually their goal, especially if you're doing something that, if they did that, they would feel ashamed of themselves. And so, you know, they kind of like project that because they're like, how this person is doing that, and they are not ashamed. Like, if I did that, I would be so extremely ashamed. Why are they not ashamed? I have to make them ashamed. I feel like it kind of works like that so many times. And especially with this sort of like, if someone like is very sensitive to the feeling of cringe, because like, I don't know, cringe is such a weird word to me, because I feel like cringe is just like shame, basically. Like, maybe I'm wrong here, but I think that cringe is just essentially like shame, embarrassment, something like that. But I would say that it's mostly shame, maybe. I don't know, actually. I have no idea. But I always interpret cringe as just shame. Yeah, and it is basically like this mechanism that you see someone doing something cringy, but what you're actually experiencing is just that you see a person doing something that, if you were doing that, you would be extremely ashamed of yourself. And that's why you experience it, because it's like, if I were in their situation, I would just die from shame, basically. But then again, I feel like the person who feels the cringe should work on themselves, and not the person who is cringy. Because the person who feels cringe is probably very, very like the underground man. Yeah, I feel like people who cringe easily are very, very much like the underground man. He would definitely like, oh, let's actually imagine the underground man and the internet. I think that if the underground man had social media, he would definitely despise Instagram and TikTok. That would be horrendous. TikTok, Instagram, such a low place for such a low people. YouTube maybe would be better for him. I feel like he would probably browse Reddit. If we're being honest, like, either, 4chan or Reddit. But I kind of have like a more Reddit energy from him, actually. Actually, when you think about it, do you think that Reddit is like the underground that the underground man writes? Because like the underground is this idea of this, like, you know, very low place and everything, where you are just so deeply ashamed, you don't want to show yourself, you are so like spiteful and everything, and like everything is bad, and like I'm better than others because I am not like them, I'm not this basic person. I'm joking. I'm actually not. Like, if you are browsing Reddit, then first of all, why? No, I'm joking. I sometimes go there, like, okay, whatever, because let's go back to the video. The point is, the underground man would be a Redditor. I am sure of that. Like a very spiteful one. And so for the rest of the day, the underground man just kept thinking about Liza, fearing that she might show up in his house, and remembering her pale, tortured face from yesterday. And he was really distressed here, as we even have a fragment here that reads, I exaggerate everything, that is where I go wrong. I repeat it to myself every hour. But however, Liza will very likely come all the same, was the refrain with which all my reflections ended. I was so uneasy that I sometimes flew into a fury. She will come, she is certain to come, I cried, running about the room. If not today, she will come tomorrow. She will find me out. The damnable romanticism of these pure hearts. But after a couple of days, Liza was still nowhere to be seen, thanks to which the underground man actually started to grow calmer. Even though he never really stopped thinking about her, as this time he was imagining that maybe he could be her salvation simply through her coming to him and them talking together. Because then he would develop and educate her, and eventually she would surely begin to love him, and then she would fling herself to his feet and say that he's her savior. And yeah, after that, he kept imagining what he would tell her, and of course, everything that he was thinking about was very bookish and romantic. And of course, in his imagination, in the end, she would become his noble wife, they would begin living together, and they would have this beautiful domestic life. Now, after going through this imaginary life with Liza, the underground man began complaining about Apollon. Mostly because, in his mind, Apollon was always looking down upon others. But you know, grain of salt here, because this is just what the underground man thinks. And the underground man really didn't like Apollon because he was an extreme pedant, in love with every button of his coat and every nail on his finger. On top of that, he rarely spoke and did his work with the air of doing the underground man the greatest favor, and he definitely looked down upon him as the greatest fool on earth. And so, as the underground man keeps complaining in his notes about Apollon being so prideful, he adds that during that time when he was so agitated about Liza, he decided to actually punish Apollon and not pay him his wages. And he even reveals here that he had been intending to do that for 2 years now, simply to show Apollon that if he liked, he could withhold his wages. And not only that, but he was purposely silent about this topic in order to force Apollon to be the first one to speak of his wages. And then he also planned that when Apollon finally mentions it, he would just take the 7 rubles out from the drawer just to show him that he has the money put aside on purpose and he just simply didn't want to pay him his wages. And then as the underground man keeps writing about this, it actually turns out that it was not the first time that he did something like this. And so we get an elaborate description of what Apollon has usually been doing in instances like that, and it turns out that he was always torturing the underground man by looking at him silently. And if that didn't work, then he was adding another torture, which was sighing very loudly. And that, of course, was always too much for the underground man to handle, and so eventually he gave Apollon what he wanted. And this time was, of course, no different, because once Apollon has started his usual thing, the underground man snapped, asked him why is he coming to his room, and then he also added, "I will tell you why you came here myself. You see, I don't give you your wages. You are so proud, you don't want to bow down and ask for it. And so you come to punish me with your stupid stares, to worry me, and you have no suspicion how stupid it is. Stupid, 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 stupid." The underground man is really something. You know, I usually try to have compassion for characters and everything, and like, I do feel for him. I do. Because like, if you live like this, your life is miserable. No matter what happens, like, the external can be so beautiful, but if you have a mind like the underground man, you're always going to be miserable. You could be, like, you could have everything and you would still be miserable if you were like the underground man. So I really feel for him. And also, as he said, in the beginning he said that he didn't really have a family and he just had some distant relatives who were always bashing him. So like, literally just no support, you know, and then they never contact him. Like, the underground man really was alone from the very, very beginning. That is true, you know, so like, that's kind of all he knows, because he never really had a family. He never really had those like connections with people when he was younger, and then when he went to school he was met with hostility. And so I feel like, I don't know, considering his life, it is kind of normal that he ended up like this, I think. There's really nothing that strange about him ending up like this. It is kind of sad. And I guess also because I feel like nowadays we have it so much different. Because like, imagine if you were in those times, you know, like 19th century Russia. Imagine that you live there. Your life is very dependent on your surrounding, basically. Because nowadays I feel like it's kind of different. Because nowadays, even if your surrounding is not the best, you can always go to the internet and you can see how other people see life. I think that the internet is so amazing when it comes to that, because basically, you know, imagine during that times, 19th century Russia. How could you even know how other people see life? You have to actually meet them physically and you have to talk to them and they have to be willing to talk to you. And nowadays, you just go on the internet, you can go on like social media stuff and you can hear the thoughts of everyone, of so many people and so many different circumstances. It's amazing. Of course, like not everything is real because like on the internet, nothing is really real. But still, I feel like it gives you more perspective, you know, because you can really learn things that you would never learn if you live during the times of the Underground Man. And so I kind of feel for him because I don't really think that he had any other choice. Because it's kind of like, okay, but when he was older, like 20 something, then he should have go somewhere and like meet new people or something. But like he would actually have to know that this is what you're supposed to do. And the thing is that he didn't know that. Because nowadays, I guess that's also the thing, because nowadays you go on the internet and like everyone is going to tell you, oh, you know, if you think that your life is like this, then like just go and meet different people or something. And you hear on the internet about this so many times. But he didn't hear about this because he didn't have the internet. He only had what was around him. That was the only thing that he had. I don't know, I kind of feel for him during those times. It was very hard to gain any sort of like different perspective, which I guess I think that you can see that he was trying to do that in a sense, because he was reading the books so much. And I think that when you read books so much, you also kind of search for like, you know, different ways of living. I feel like the Underground Man had this intuition that something was wrong, but he just couldn't quite get it. Yeah, I cannot, you know what, now I feel for him. Because that's horrible. His circumstances were horrible. Maybe I'm mistaken here. Maybe now I'm too soft on him or something. I don't know. So yeah, let's have some compassion for the Underground Man, because I feel like he just had awful circumstances. That's the reality of that. And so after that moment, after the Underground Man said what was on the screen, he took the money out of the drawer, but told Apollon that he won't give it to him until he comes respectfully with bowed head to beg his pardon. And to this, Apollon just said that this is some nonsense, as he was not guilty of anything, and actually he could summon the Underground Man to the police station for such insulting behavior. But to this, the Underground Man was just like, oh yeah? Then go on, summon me. And to this, Apollon just eventually left this place and went to his own room. And after that, the Underground Man concluded that, you know who's guilty of this whole situation? Liza. Yeah, because if it hadn't been for her, then nothing of this would have happened. Then, not long after this whole situation, someone softly and slowly opened the door and came into the room. And it was, of course, Liza. And now the Underground Man just stood here completely crushed and confused, trying his best to smile and wrap himself with his ragged dressing gown. Then, after a couple of minutes, he told her to sit down. She did, and looked at him as if she were expecting something, which just drove him mad. And so, in that moment, the Underground Man decided that he will make her pay for everything, which I was feeling some compassion for him, but I feel like it's just slowly evaporating from me. And so he then desperately tries to save his own ego by saying to her, "You have found me in a strange position, Liza." I began stammering and knowing that this was the wrong way to begin. No, don't imagine anything," I cried, seeing that she had suddenly flushed. "I am not ashamed of my poverty. On the contrary, I look with pride on my poverty. I am poor but honorable. One can be poor and honorable, I muttered. And so right after that, he ran up to Apollon, gave him his wages, and then told him in fever that he has to rescue him and bring him some tea and rusks from the nearby restaurant, because otherwise he will be a miserable man. And at first Apollon just ignored him, but eventually, after about 3 minutes of the underground man just standing and sweating, Apollon felt pity for him. And so Apollon decided to do what he was asked to do, while the underground man came back to Liza. And so then the underground man sat next to her, and suddenly he shouted that he will take his life. And as Liza cried out, what is he even talking about? He just repeated that he will take his life and that Apollon is just a torturer to him. But then he suddenly began to cry, and Liza got pretty terrified, and so she asked him what is even going on, to which he just shouted for her to give him some water, kind of trying to save his face by insinuating that this was just some sort of attack. Then Apollon came in, gave them the tea. The underground man blushed terribly, but Apollon just left without paying any attention to them. And then the underground man asked Liza whether she despises him, but that just made her very confused, as she didn't really know how to answer that. And well, the underground man is really something here, as we get a fragment that reads, "Drink your tea," I said to her angrily. I was angry with myself, but of course, it was she who would have to pay for it. A horrible spite against her suddenly surged up in my heart. I believe I could have killed her. To revenge myself on her, I swore inwardly not to say a word to her all the time. She is the cause of it all, I thought. Amazing. And so after that, they sat in silence for a while, and the underground man, of course, was not drinking the tea on purpose, because he figured that it will make Liza embarrassed. But I don't really think that it had much effect on her, because they did sit in silence for a while, but eventually she started talking, and she said that she really wants to get away from her current occupation. To this, the underground man, of course, stayed silent, and so she eventually said that maybe she's just in the way, and so she began getting up, but the underground man stopped her. And after he did, he asked her why did she even come here to tell him that, and you can imagine how distressed he was when he said that. And then he got even worse after he concluded that he will actually tell her why she showed up, which is also something that he does a lot. It's like he's not actually interested in what the person has to say, because like he thinks that he knows better. It's like, oh no, I don't even care what you have to say. I know exactly why you do stuff and everything. But still, he concludes that it's all because he said some sentimental stuff to her the last time they've seen each other. And so she's now soft as butter, and she's longing for some fine sentiments again. But she has to know that he was just laughing at her, and he's laughing at her now as well. And so then he explained to her that right before they've met, he was insulted at the dinner by the guys who came before him to the establishment, and so basically he had to avenge the insult on someone else to get back on his feet. And well, he couldn't find the guys, but then Liza showed up, and so he just decided to take revenge on her. And he also added here that he had been humiliated, and so he wanted to humiliate as well. He was treated like a rag, and so he wanted to show his power. And to this, Liza just turned completely white, and she wanted to say something, but she couldn't. And instead, she just listened to him with her lips parted and her eyes wide open. So then the underground man continued, mocking her for thinking that he came to save her, and saying that power was the only thing he needed. He wanted to just bring her to tears and humiliate her. And on top of that, he gave her his address just because he got frightened, but then he cursed at her for that, as he already hated her. And then after saying all of that, he went into this big ramble, saying that what he really wanted was for everyone to go to hell, as he just wanted to be in peace. And he also added here that he was extremely ashamed of his poverty, to the point where he would never forgive her finding him in this wretched dressing gown. And not only that, but he also won't ever forgive her for the tears he could not help shedding before her just now. And so basically you can just say that he won't ever forgive her for being vulnerable before her. And then the underground man gave us a little description of himself, as he wrote, I am the nastiest, stupidest, absurdest, and most envious of all the worms on earth, who are not a bit better than I am, but the devil knows why, are never put to confusion. While I shall always be insulted by every louse, that is my doom. But then something strange happened, as Liza actually understood much more than he thought, because she understood that he was extremely unhappy. And so the frightened expression on her face was followed by sorrow, and she even wanted to stop the underground man from talking badly about himself. And then she rushed to him, she threw her arms around him, and she bursted into tears. And the underground man sobbed as well. And after that, he went to the sofa, fell on it, and then sobbed hysterically for a quarter of an hour. And as he was in the middle of that, Liza actually came up to him, put her arms around him, and stayed motionless. But eventually, his hysteria changed into a deep feeling of shame, and he now saw Liza as a hero and himself as a crushed and humiliated creature. Which is kind of interesting, considering that he thought that the opposite was going to happen. But eventually he managed to raise his head and look at Liza, while another feeling suddenly flamed up in his heart, one of mastery and possession. And so he then gripped her hands, and he noticed that he both hated her and was very drawn to her, and one feeling actually intensified the other. And Liza, on the other hand, looked at him with amazement, and then she embraced him. After all of that, Liza stayed on the ground with her head leaning against the bed, possibly crying, while the underground man was rushing up and down the room, irritated that she wouldn't go away. And then we actually get an interesting fragment where the underground man explains why he was incapable of loving her. And so he writes, I was incapable of love, for I repeat, with me loving meant tyrannizing and showing my moral superiority. I have never in my life been able to imagine any other sort of love, and have nowadays come to the point of sometimes thinking that love really consists in the right, freely given by the beloved object, to tyrannize over her. And then the underground man describes that as he was running up and down the room, it's not like he really hated Liza, it's more like he was just incredibly oppressed by her presence here. He just wanted her to disappear, he wanted peace, and to be left alone in his underground world. But she still remained in the same place until eventually the underground man tapped on a piece of furniture, which then made her come back to herself and start dressing herself up. Then she went up to him, but he just gave her a very spiteful grin just to keep up appearances, and then he turned away. After that, she said goodbye to him and headed towards the door, but before she was able to leave, he ran up to her, grabbed her hand, opened it, gave her something, and then closed it again. And then after that, he ran up to the other corner of the room. And then as he's describing this situation, he writes that in that moment he actually gave her money, but he did it purely from spite. It was not an impulse from the heart, but from his evil brain. And so he then rushed at that corner of the room, but then right after Liza left, he rushed after her and then cried out her name on the staircase, but of course not too loudly. And then he just heard her going out of the building, and so he came back to his room feeling pretty terrible. And then as he was looking around the room, he noticed a crumbled 5-ruble note, the same one he gave her just a moment ago. And so as he describes this situation, he writes that he might have expected that she might do that, but then immediately after he writes that no, he had such a big ego that he could never imagine that she would do it. And so after that, he ran after her in order to fall down before her, sob with remorse and kiss her feet, but of course she was nowhere to be found. Because of that, the underground man came back home, and for the rest of the day he was just overthinking everything, coming to the conclusion that he had never endured such suffering and remorse. And then as he continues writing his notes, we learn that actually that was the last time that he saw Liza, and he had never heard of her again. Following that, we go back to the present times, and the underground man writes that everything he wrote is just an evil memory. And And he also adds that he actually has many more evil memories, but perhaps it's better to just end his notes here. And then he also wonders that maybe he made a mistake by writing those notes, because he just felt ashamed the whole time he was writing down his story. So it's not really literature, but it's more like punishment. Crime and punishment. You can watch it on my channel, actually. 6 hours of crime and punishment. And then as the underground man keeps writing, he adds that every story needs a hero, but he's only able to provide all the traits of an anti-hero. And then at the very end, he starts to argue with the readers, so us, and he accuses us of many different things, and then he even creates a sort of dialogue, being basically like, oh, you would definitely say this, and then I would answer that. And then after that, he makes his last point, which is that we don't even know what living means anymore. And that if someone were to leave us alone without books, we would all be lost, since we wouldn't know what to cling to, what to love, what to hate, what to respect, and what to despise. And he also thinks that we are all oppressed at being human, we are ashamed of it, and we think that it's disgrace. But then after all of that, he eventually writes that he no longer wants to write from underground. And right after, Dostoevsky concludes that the notes of course don't end here, since the man couldn't stop himself from writing more, but it's better for us to stop here. And with that, we end the story. And so, that was the whole story of Notes from Underground. Did you like it? For me, I really got so tired of overthinking while reading this book, especially I think because, you know, I tend to overthink ideas that I think about, because it's just like, oh, but maybe this, but blah, 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 blah. That's basically my thought process. But even though I tend to overthink ideas, I don't think that I overthink my life that much, in a sense. Maybe in the past I was overthinking my life, but currently I just kind of like do something and then I see what happens, and then I do something again and then I see what happens, if that makes sense. And so that was like a very tiring experience for me, to read about someone who was creating so many like elaborate scenarios in his head. At one point it was just like, dude, just do things, just do stuff, just do a thing, see what happens, and then you can react to it. Like, you don't have to just create every single scenario in your head, because the reality is always going to be different. I think that it's so much better to kind of like know how to react to things instead of creating like perfect scenarios in your head and then playing them out. Because thing is that like you are not capable of creating or like predicting every single thing that's going to happen. You never really know what's going to happen. So like, of course, planning for the future, yeah, important, but like maybe not every single detail. And you know, when I was reading Notes from Underground, I kept thinking about this one fragment from Crime and Punishment where Raskolnikov lies down somewhere at the end of the book, and instead of thinking, he just feels. And it's concluded there that at that moment, life had stepped into the place of theory, which I really just completely, absolutely love that quote. And I think that this is exactly the remedy that the underground man needed, to just kind of like live and do stuff instead of thinking so much. Because like at the end of the day, you can't really think yourself into a perfect life. And I think that in some sort of way, the underground man was kind of trying to do that. Like, he had so many ideas about how people should act, what they should talk about, and just in general, he had this very like idealistic view of life, in the sense that everything had to be perfect for him, because if it wasn't, then he was resenting it. And the thing is that like, life is never perfect. No human is perfect, you are not perfect, no theory is perfect, no situation plays out in a perfect way. And so if someone expects perfection, then they will always end up disappointed. Which, like, ask me how I know that. I am also a recovering perfectionist, so I'm really speaking from experience here. But like, let me tell you that the moment that I started to allow myself to be kind of messy, my life improved so much, like actually so much. And I feel like for me, the perfect example is this channel, because like, it's very much not perfect. There are so many things that I wish I could improve, and also like, none of my ideas are perfect, which I am aware that, you know, I'm kind of like getting into some deeper stuff, which I didn't even plan. I thought that this channel is just going to be like summaries of literature, And now it turns out that for some reason I just tend to think about stuff like this. I don't know. It's kind of, I don't know. I have no idea at this point what is going on this channel. But at the same time, I'm just having the time of my life here. And so I think that it's so much better to be messy, but actually like live and do things instead of creating this unreachable vision of perfection in your head. But then again, I guess you could always say that like, but why is it better? Like, is pleasure the meaning, or like something, I don't know, the goal of life? And does life have a goal? We are actually going to talk about this because the next book that I'm going to do for the channel is The Stranger by Albert Camus, and I actually already read it. I already have some thoughts, and I think that this is going to be a very interesting video, The Stranger, because it really got me thinking. And not even about the meaning of life, because like I guess I know that, you know, the meaning of life and everything, that's kind of the point of The Stranger, but just like the character of Meursault, or however you pronounce it. Why do I relate to him? This is scary. Like, I've never... Okay, you know what? I'm going to leave it for the next video because like I guess I'm probably going to get deeper into this, but let me just... a little spoiler for my next video. I have no idea what to do with myself now, because after reading The Stranger, I am in such a weird place because I really relate to him, and I see that this is not a popular opinion, and I don't know what to do with myself about it. And I mean, like, because I know that Meursault is kind of this like a person without any emotions and everything, and I don't mean that, because I definitely have emotions. I guess you can even see it on the channel. I am a pretty emotional person, but just like the way he thinks, the way his brain works, the way he like understands the things around him and everything, and the conclusions that he draws, and just like, I don't know, there's something about his mind, you know? So not about his emotions, because I do feel emotions, and I can't relate to him when it comes to the emotional level, but when it comes to the mental level, I am shocked, because this is literally me. Like, and I don't know what to do with it now. So yeah, so the next video is going to be interesting. I feel like I should probably get some sort of diagnosis for that, to be honest, because like, I don't know. At the end of the day though, I probably won't, so... So yeah, other than that, because that was such off topic, but I just had to tell you that. Because I am just in shambles. If you want to hear more about this, then yeah, the next video is going to be about The Stranger. So you can subscribe, If you liked this video, or if you want to see The Stranger, then subscribe. You're not going to regret it. So, after this slight off-topic thingy, I actually also have something to say when it comes to the underground man's emotions. Because basically, I have this idea or something, I don't know, that basically your emotional state is sort of like a lens through which you see the world. And so you can really see that for the underground man, his emotional state was terrible because it was always full of shame and frustration. And you can really see that those emotions were sort of like a magnet in his head that was basically attracting all of the memories, ideas, and just like the details of his day-to-day life that basically matched this emotional state of shame and frustration. I think that your emotional state really influences what your brain comes up with. It's almost like your brain kind of tries to match your emotional state or deepen it. I really think that it is the case. Because I really think about this. I think that if you, for example, just lie down and see what your brain comes up with, then chances are that it's going to come up with some ideas or memories that are going to match your current emotional state. So if you're very angry, maybe you're going to remember all of the memories from the past that also made you angry. And I am sure that you experienced it in your life, that like, for example, you were feeling very angry and then you were just going about your day basically, and you know, so many things that were happening around you were making you more angry, even though probably some of the things that you're noticing when you're angry, you probably wouldn't really pay attention to them if you felt something else. Your emotional state really influences whatever pops in your head, you know? Like whatever thoughts, whatever you see in the world and everything, your emotional state really, really influences that. I really, really believe that. At the same time, remember that this is not my field, you know, like this is, I'm just talking from observation here. My source here is my observation, basically. So I don't really know, but I really believe that it has to be like this. I don't know, at least it is like this for me. So I don't know if it's like this for every human, but I know that it's certainly like this for me. And because of all of that, because I actually have a point here, because of all of that, I believe that love really is the most important thing in this world, which is biblical. It is biblical because the Bible says that basically you can have like perfect faith. You can give all of your possessions away. You can have all the knowledge of this world and know all the mysteries and everything. And yet, if you don't have love, you don't have anything. Like, that's biblical. If you don't have love, you don't have anything. And this is like some serious stuff, you know, because like when you see Christianity, when you see the Bible, faith, giving away your possessions, knowledge, stuff like this seems very important. And yet the Bible says that you can have all of those things, and if you don't have love, you don't have anything. And I think that it's really true. But like again, I'm talking from experience, so I don't know. But I think that it really, really is true. I just really believe it with my whole heart that love really is the most important thing. And also, I'm not really talking about this kind of love that's more like, you know, like love and peace, let's not care about anything in this world and just vibe and just feel good. No, I'm not talking about this kind of love. I'm talking more about this love that really lets you understand people and the world around you. Because basically, I made a point in the beginning that I believe that your emotional state is the lens through which you see the world. And I also have this very strong belief that love is like the only lens that allows you to see the truth about the people around you and about the world. Like, if you don't see people through the lens of love, I don't really think that you understand them well. And again, I'm talking from experience, you know, this is not really something that I just came up with, that I was just like thinking about and like, yeah, it kind of makes sense. Like, no, I am talking from experience. The moment I started to like really see people and the world around me through love, that was the moment when I really started to have this like very deep internal feeling that I finally get it, in a sense. And I cannot really explain it well, because it really is more like an experience, you know. It's there are things about this world that the words don't really describe well, and I think that having those experiences is kind of like that. And now I'm going to be annoying, and I'm not going to elaborate on that. And the reason for it is that I really think that this is something that you have to experience yourself in order to really truly get it. I don't know, you would have to really influence your emotions to kind of like basically put yourself in different emotional states for like a longer period of time and just observe what your brain is doing. That's your homework. Make yourself feel different emotions for like a longer period of time, but like really truly, and then just observe what your brain is doing. Observe what it's noticing, how it views people around you, how it views situations around you, and also try to do it with love. Like, get yourself into this state of love and notice how you see the world around you and the people around you. So yeah, I don't know. This is more like an experience stuff. I think that there are so many things about this world that you just can't put into words because words are so limited. Yeah, and there's always just like more to it than that. So yeah, I believe that the underground man was really suffering a lot, also because of his emotional state, because he felt so much shame and frustration that he basically started to see everything through that lens, and he saw people around him through that lens. His ideas were very, very influenced by those emotions, and just everything around him was just basically based on shame and frustration. And biblically, the most ideal state is love. Then again, is it true? I don't know. I have no idea. I just believe it. and I experienced it, I think. So yeah, homework for you. Get yourself in different emotional states and just observe what your brain is doing, how it interprets the world around you, how it sees the people around you, what kind of ideas does it come up with, what kind of memories are you recalling. I think that it's all very, very connected. The things that your brain does and your emotional state. Which, now that I think of it, maybe that's not the best homework after The Underground Man, because like the whole point of this book is not to overthink. And now I'm basically telling you to overthink a lot. But you know, it is what it is. So I don't really have anything else to add, so thank you so much for watching, especially that you're watching till the end. You can subscribe to the channel, that's going to be very, very nice, and bye bye!